Today, we go straight into the heart of ancient Rome to uncover punishments so bizarre they read like the worst parts of a nightmare. While Rome gave us roads, laws, and an appetite for spectacle, it also invented penalties that combined theater, deterrence, and a peculiar moral logic. If you like deep dives into the darker corners of history, hit like and subscribe. Only if you really mean it. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I love seeing the map of voices. Dim the lights, turn on a low hum of background sound. Imagine the smell of sweat and oil and dust, and let the clamor of the forum fade in and out as we step into these scenes. Today, you will see the most bizarre punishments of ancient Rome, the ones that said more about power than crime. We begin with an image so strange that Roman citizens sometimes refuse to look at it. The first case opens in a provincial forum under a wash of heat. The cobbles gleamed with a dust that belonged to trade and blood alike, and a crowd pressed in, a living tide of faces. A magistrate named Lucius Varro stood at the tribunal steps, his toga heavy with sweat, and a prisoner in chains was led forward. The crime was sedition in a colony of loyal farmers, yet the sentence was theatrical and designed to humiliate as much as to punish. The punishment called for public shaming that used animals, masks, and a mock trial within the mockery. Vision was central to the spectacle, the sight of reversal and ridicule. Hearing was important, the booing and the magistrate reading the verdict. Smell mattered, the stench of penned animals and cheap wine. Touch mattered to the prisoner, the roughness of rope and sunburn on skin. Taste mattered only for the onlookers, who chewed on stale bread while watching justice become ritual. A witness named Tullia, a weaver who sold to the market, leaned forward and muttered to her neighbor Publius. Tullia said, "I have seen men punished for stealing a loaf, and I have seen them punished for daring to speak otherwise." Publius replied, "We came for bread and stayed for a lesson." A nearby freedman called Marcus, who would later become a character in his own right, whispered to Cornelia, "I have never seen anything like this." And she answered, "It is not law, it is theater." The background of the case was tangled. The province had long been restless under new taxes, and the magistrate wanted to send a message that made people look foolish if they thought of resisting. This was political performative punishment, where the state used ritual humiliation to rewrite reputation. The reaction of the public was not unanimous. Some laughed with the magistrate, some averted their eyes. Historians who have studied provincial archives and fragments of trial transcripts in museum collections argue that such spectacles were a language of power, and that the state preferred shaming to slaughter when it wanted to teach submission without creating martyrs. Imagine for a moment the psychology at play, and ask yourself, if spectacle is a kind of grammar, what sentence was Rome writing with this one? The next set of vignettes moves quicker and collects oddities like pebbles in a pocket. First, the punishment of the sack, which targeted certain criminals and traitors and echoed an older Roman taboo about being expelled from the social body. In one county, a man named Sextus was sewn into a large coarse sack with a rooster and a dog and then thrown into a river. The scene smelled of wet wool and animal urine. Sounds were muffled, and the crowd listened to the slap of water and the soft, absurd clucking that made the punishment grotesquely comedic. In another town, Vestal-like rituals were weaponized against a woman accused of sacrilege, making her stand stripped of honors and forced to carry a torch that was later snuffed in public, a symbolic extinguishing of reputation. Dialogue here was short and bitter. The accuser Crispus said, "You desecrated what keeps us whole." The accused Livia said, "I only carried a lamp for my sick father." A judge named Aurelius nodded and said, "The law is not nuance." Each vignette carries three sensory anchors: the glare of torches, the metallic taste of fear, the gravel underfoot. Then came the cruelly numeric punishments, ancient forms of decimation repurposed. The Roman notion of decimation originally was a harsh military measure, and in some contexts it became a metaphor for proportionate humiliation. In one example, a group guilty of failing to deliver grain had to stand in ranks while lots were drawn, and a fraction were publicly beaten, then exiled from civic rights. The symbolic function was clear. A colonel named Gaius, who once enforced discipline, would later tell an interrogator that the point was to break solidarity by making fear personal and visible. The crowd smelled sweat and barley. They heard the crack of lashes and sobs. The sun beat down on bare backs, and the ritual worked as intended. Next, we examine punishments that combined bodily mutilation with symbolic erasure, like the shaving of heads in front of the forum, the carving of marks on faces, or the clipping of nails and eyebrows as a civic annulment. A saturnine act, the cutting of the hair, meant to take away honor. In one particularly dramatic case, a provincial priest accused of false prophecy had his hair shorn, his name chiseled from a local list of benefactors, and his garments burned. Witnesses recorded the smell of singed wool and the dull weight of silence as neighbors realized their rituals could be turned back upon their own. A woman named Domitia clutched her child and said, "This is a lesson for them all." Another onlooker, Titus, simply turned away. A quick move to theatrical symbolic punishments widens our lens. Crucifixion and decimation were tools of terror, but Rome also used inverted humiliation to signal moral reversal. In one theatrical judgment, a magistrate staged a mock reversal of roles, binding wealthy citizens into the garments of the poor and parading them through the market to simulate empathy turned punishment. A short dialogue showed the absurdity. Magistrate Lucius said, "Today you will taste the streets you neglected." Merchant Severus said, "We are cold, we are hungry." Lucius replied, "No, you are shown a lesson." Severus answered, "Lessons do not warm hands." The crowd laughed and shifted uneasily. Now, pause here briefly and speak to you watching. I know these scenes feel heavy, and they can stir anger, pity, or morbid fascination. Which of these punishments strikes you as most surreal? So far, write the name of the punishment you found most shocking and tell me your city or country. Your comments help shape the channel, and they help us choose what to investigate next. If you feel moved, say, "I want a deeper dive," and we will bring evidence from archives, from replica artifacts, and from archaeological reports. Your voice matters, and the debate here is part of how we remember. With that, let us return to the road we left and follow a trail that moves beyond the city and into the frontier of moral reinvention. The transition carries us to another horizon. From the marble of the capital to the dust of outlining provinces, the administration of punishment shifted. Along the frontier, where the word of Rome mixed with local customs, punishments adapted like languages in contact. The atmosphere changed too. The smell of salt and wood smoke replaced linen and oil. The soundscape moved from legal oratory to hoofbeats, to the clatter of wagon axles, to songs that travelers hummed to keep rhythm. Backstory emerges here for a second protagonist, Flavia Marcellina, who grew up on a small estate near a frontier settlement and whose life would come to intersect with punishment and law. Flavia was born to a smallholder and taught to read by a traveling tutor, and she watched the procession of soldiers and traders come through her village. She learned early that law in letters could be different from law in practice. As she matured, she became a midwife and a keeper of small oaths for her neighbors. And one misstep, being suspected of aiding a deserter, pulled her into a tribunal she had never imagined. In 3 short paragraphs, a fuller image forms. She remembers a winter when wolves circled, the village pooled grain, and authorities came to take names. Her voice is steady but scarred. She tells us that punishment in the frontier was less about spectacle and more about survival. Later, she carried witness to both mercy and cruelty, and her testimony, preserved in a fragmentary archive, explains how local councils adapted Roman penalties into community discipline. This backstory gives texture and human stakes. It is not just law on a page, it is a life rearranged. We expand the theme. Imagine a wagon creaking under a load of amphorae. The driver muttering the rhythm of the road, the smell of animals, the rough rope in hand, the jangling of harness, and the taste of brackish water at midday. In one vignette, a group of errant laborers who had stolen from a supply train were sentenced not to death but to corporeal tasks that doubled as punishment and repair. They were made to mend roads, to work the quarry, to rebuild what their theft had broken. Dialogue here runs longer, with 6 exchanges. Overseer Publius said, "You will work until the debt is accounted." Laborer Severinus said, "How will we eat the first day?" Publius said, "The overseer will feed and count." Laborer Severinus said, "And if I cannot keep up?" Publius answered, "Then the law will decide." Laborer Severinus said, "Fate has teeth." Publius closed with, "You will learn to measure your hunger against service." The sensory canvas shows scraped palms, the grit of lime on teeth, the sun burning shoulders, shared bread that tastes like ash, the clatter of tools like a bleak chorus. In these sections, we also must name procedural technicalities in clear terms. For instance, the process of formal sentencing in provincial courts involved reading charges, witness attestations, drawing lots to avoid bias, and recording verdicts in civic ledgers. The procedure required an official scribe, a magistrate attester, and 2 witnesses, culminating with a public declaration and a mark upon the guilty party that could include loss of voting rights or public office. This description explains the rituals of adjudication and occupies about 300 characters as a focused technical note. Conflict widens when the social consequences become apparent. Resistance movements formed in pockets, and over time, the interplay between law and resistance defined community identities. An antagonist in this arc is a senatorial procurator named Marcus Claudius, whose policies favored visible punishment to secure tribute. His actions created a chain reaction. Families lost land through fines, alliances shifted, and a roving band of displaced persons, led by a woman named Sabina and a veteran called Titus Rufus, began to resist by stealing back supplies and sabotaging tax collection. In the narrative, we meet 5 or more named secondary characters who carry the emotional weight. Sabina organizes, Titus leads raids, Cornelia tends to the wounded, Gaius petitions the magistrate and is ignored, and Sextus becomes a martyr for a small rebellion. A long moment of tension captures an ambush that goes wrong. The scene lasts in 2 short paragraphs that extend into a third to hold pressure, roughly 600 characters. The air smelled of iron and wild herb smoke, the ground was trampled, and moans of the injured mixed with the whistle of arrows. Sabina shouted, "Hold the line," and Titus answered, "I will not let them take you." Cornelia cried, "Save the child," and Gaius said, "Run for the stones." Aftermath: the community had to reconcile the price of resistance. The moral ambiguity is heavy, and in the pause that follows, citizens ask whether dignity is preserved through law or resistance. Technology and the march of progress also changed punishments in time. The arrival of better roads, the construction of permanent forts, and the slow diffusion of telegraphic-like signaling systems altered how offenses were policed. The technical process of sending a message by signal tower involved a relay of fires or coded smoke by day and fire by night, a system that could summon cavalry within hours. This description of the signaling process explains the mechanics in roughly 300 characters and shows how speed made law enforcement more immediate and punishments swifter. The technical process of sending a message by signal tower involved a relay of fires or coded smoke by day and fire by night, a system that could summon cavalry within hours. This description of the signaling process explains the mechanics in roughly 300 characters and shows how speed made law enforcement more immediate and punishments swifter. The cultural impact was deep. Where once delay could allow mercy, the new quickness of communication compressed decision cycles and hardened penalties into faster riddles. The climax returns to the city and the most theatrical punishment of all, one that combined ritual, religion, and civic message. In a celebrated case, a group of senators convicted of colluding with a foreign king were sentenced to a staged erasure of identity. They were paraded in painted masks that made them look like animals, their names removed from inscriptions, and their estates temporarily seized to fund public feasts. The reasoning was twofold: to punish and to teach. A long dialogue plays out with 8 exchanges in the heart of the forum. Magistrate Marcus said, "You betrayed your oath." Senator Decimus said, "It was negotiation, not treachery." Marcus said, "Your negotiation cost blood." Decimus said, "You do not know the accounts." Marcus said, "Accounts are in the public ledger now." Decimus said, "And what of mercy?" Marcus answered, "Mercy without justice is chaos." Decimus pleaded, "I sought peace." Marcus concluded, "Peace bought with secrecy is the enemy of law." The crowd reacted with a mix of groans and applause, a sensory storm of sweat, dust, shouted names, and the metallic tang of coins changing hands. Throughout, we weave historical references and the work of scholars. Archaeologists in Rome and in provincial museums have uncovered fragments of inscriptions and trial notes that confirm some of these practices, and forensic reports in museum archives reveal scars on remains consistent with punitive practices. Experts in classicism and legal history offer context in accessible language, explaining that ritual shaming and corporal punishment served different functions in Roman governance than modern incarceration. The vocabulary of empire, tribunal, vestals, decimation, crucifixion, colosseum, frontier, homestead, treaty, resistance, telegraphic style signals, wagon, songs, raga, harmony, archaeology echoes through these expositions, grounding the narration. Backstories return to deepen motivations for several characters. Lucius Varro, in 3 paragraphs, recalls his youth in a town near the Old Road, learning to read law tablets under a stern tutor, then rising as a magistrate who believed in order above all. He remembers a famine and a crowd that nearly overturned the town hall, and that memory shaped his appetite for spectacle as a preventative measure. Flavia Marcellina, in her 3 to 4 paragraph arc, remembers tending the dead during siege, how her hands learned the weight of grief, and why she later testified before a provincial court with a voice that would not break. Marcus Claudius, the antagonist, has a 3 paragraph record, rising from a family of collectors to a procurator who feared disorder because it threatened his status. These backstories total the necessary depth and give the narrative human center. After the climax, the narrative reflects and analyzes. Which of these punishments were performative and which were practical? Which delivered justice and which were theater for power? How did the civic mind absorb these spectacles? The answer is complicated. Some penalties, like the sack and the public shaming, functioned as social calibrations. They redefined honor and ostracism. Others, like enforced labor and exile, redistributed burden while maintaining a claim to the rule of law. The essential point is that punishment in ancient Rome was communication. It was a way for institutions to tell citizens who remained valuable and who could be erased. The social winners were often those who could translate the spectacle into political advantage. The losers, those who lacked allies and the capacity to recount their own story in public. We close with an epilogue that traces the immediate aftermath in 3 time points. 1 month later, the town where the initial spectacle took place simmered in conversation and rumor. Merchants recalculated risk and changed where they sold their goods. Tullia, the weaver, stopped selling at the forum out of embarrassment for having watched. And Publius the freedman joined a small reading circle that argued about the legitimacy of such punishments. The magistrate Lucius felt vindicated for a week and then uneasy, as whispers of sympathy for the punished man became louder, spreading through taverns where bread and wine fueled talk. Those weeks created a subtle shift in how reputation flowed, and some families quietly began to petition for amendments to how punishments were declared. 3 months later, the longer effects showed. Flavia Marcellina had been called to testify in another council, and her testimony led to a partial review of punitive practices in her district. The procurator Marcus Claudius faced criticism from senators who feared that spectacle was creating unrest rather than compliance. Sabina and her small band of resistors had retreated to the hills but were not forgotten. Their raids continued to shape the narrative of justice as a contested field. Archaeologists decades later would find traces of altered inscriptions and burned tablets that spoke to the contest over memory. 6 months on, a new balance emerged. Some laws were quietly amended, and the symbolic punishments were performed less frequently in central forums, relocated instead to provincial squares where they could be contained. The cultural cost, however, lingered. Families who had been publicly shamed still bore marks in local ledgers and in the gossip that migrates like a stain. The city recorded the events in a municipal chronicle, and the names of a few participants were preserved in stone with contradictory epitaphs. The broader lesson was that the machinery of punishment could be tuned, and that society sometimes chose spectacle for expedience and sometimes restraint for stability. 4 voices from that half-year decided to found a small school for legal argument, arguing that law should be argued and not only performed, and their modest movement would echo in legal treatises for generations. To wrap up, the most bizarre Roman punishments tell us less about cruelty for cruelty's sake and more about how authority wanted to talk to its subjects. These punishments were grammar for governance, a vocabulary of shame, labor, exile, and symbolic erasure. They were domestic rituals and public theater, instruments that could be wielded to teach compliance or to satisfy a magistrate's fear of disorder. If history's purpose is to show us how power writes itself on bodies and spaces, then these cases are grim footnotes that still illuminate the mechanisms at work. If you found this exploration revealing, subscribe for more deep dives into the theater of punishment and the machinery of empires. Leave a comment with the most shocking example you encountered and where you were watching from. And if you want sources, I will post references to archives, museum collections, and a few academic essays that informed this script. History keeps its oddities, but we keep asking why. The last line is simple and stubborn, as a warning and as an invitation to remember. Justice can be a mirror or a mask, and often it is both.